Hello, in this video I want to answer the question, is there a way for Ukraine to win the war against Russia? And I truly do believe in that old wisdom that claims that all great empires, before they are defeated on the battlefield, are defeated from within by their internal weaknesses that are then exploited or made worse by the war they are fighting against their internal opponents. The very same wisdom was true when applied to the example of, let's say, the Soviet Union and the Aztec Empire and the British Empire. Okay, so uh, I want to uh, explain to you this scenario in which I do see Russia being destabilized to the extent that it is unable to win the war against Ukraine. And when I speak of Ukraine winning, uh, I'm simply speaking of them conquering back their lost territory of Luhansk and Donetsk. But what many people forget about Russia is that Russia is not just Moscow, not just the fancy and glorious central regions of Russia that you see, well, both on Western and Russian media. Russia is also Kamchatka, a place where not that long ago, a half a year ago, there was a volcanic eruption, but due to all the other crazy stuff happening in the world, nobody really paid that much attention to that volcanic eruption. And ever since the fall of communism, people in smaller cities like Kamchatka or in the region of Bashkortostan have this feeling that the central regions are exploiting them and not investing enough money into smaller towns. Now, a legitimate critique of communism was that not enough money was invested in rural areas and in agriculture generally. And that is true. Putin's Russia actually made their agriculture sector much more profitable and better when compared to communism. But when it comes to smaller towns and far eastern regions, they probably did have a better life under communism, which is why many of them are nostalgic about communism, and why, for example, in 2008 protests against Putin, there were signs down with capitalism in Vladivostok, for example. But what was happening recently in Bashkortostan, this region you can see on the map, or Bashkiria, actually surprised me. There are pretty big protests happening right now in Bashkortostan against the Putin regime. First, I want to explain to you the meta picture that's causing the protests, and then I'll explain the very specific reason that triggered the protests in Bashkortostan, or in Bashkiria, as it is called. Well, ever since the times of Stalin, and especially even after Stalin, the right-wing fractions in the Soviet military were afraid of minorities, non-Russian minorities, outnumbering them in the Soviet Union, since they had higher birth rates and since Russians were generally experiencing a demographic crisis for many reasons. In the Soviet Union, for example, some think it was happening because the legalization of abortion and the fact that the Soviet cities were overcrowded. But there are still debates about it. But what is certain is that today Russia is experiencing another demographic crisis in which the minorities are having a much higher birth rates than the Russians. And those fears became even greater in the late Soviet Union in the 1980s. And the Russians began to become a minority in the Soviet Union. And now some argue the same will happen even in Putin's Russia. But okay, what is actually triggering these protests in Bashkortostan? So, according to some analysts, it is the fact that people from far eastern regions and generally from republics within Russia that are mostly indigenous, it is those people that are getting recruited at a higher rate than Russians that is triggering their dissatisfaction with the Putin regime. It is not so much this liberal critique of the war in Ukraine, that the war itself is pointless or that Putin is a dictator, but simply this idea that they are not being treated fairly. And this is an old map, but it is still true as of today that people from these regions are getting recruited at a higher rate than, for example, people from the Moscow region. And it is true that people from these regions are also getting killed at a higher rate at the battlefield. And this problem is actually tied with a complex history of racism in the Russian Empire, in the same way in which the expansion of America was fueled by this idea of manifest destiny and of this idea that the Americans have a duty to civilize Indians and take away their land, and also the enslavement of black people was crucial in establishing the American expansion. Well, in the same way, the Russian Empire was equally fanatical in their eastern expansion, and people often forget that indigenous people of the East were treated pretty much exactly the same as Indians in the United States. And for a long time in the Russian Empire, they were not even allowed to use their own language in schools. They did not have their own republics. And then with communists coming to power, something weird and sort of paradoxical happened. On the one hand, Stalin did encourage minorities to take positions of power. One could even call him woke or something like proto-woke for that. I mean, Stalin himself was an example of a minority that became the leader of the Soviet Union, which was not something that could happen in the Russian Empire. Khrushchev, also an example of a Ukrainian guy becoming the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And on the one hand, the Soviet Union was progressive towards minorities by giving them their own republics, but on the other hand, Stalin also dog-whistled to the right-wing fractions within the military that pretty much saw the Soviet Union as the new version of the empire, and he did use Russian nationalism and chauvinism in order to strengthen the Soviet Union as he saw it, for example, by replacing the Crimean Tatars with Russians. And in Kazakhstan, something similar happened, and even in parts of Ukraine. So, yes, on the one hand, Stalin did dog whistle to both the right-wing fractions in the military and the leftist fractions by, for example, being anti-rich peasants, by allowing minorities to hold positions of power, for example, in Azerbaijan, Armenia, by insisting on the fact that minorities have a right to have their own republics, which is what some right-wing generals actually did not like about Stalin. But yes, even in the Soviet Union, minorities, for example, got disproportionately hurt under the collectivization of the land, which the process wasn't designed to hurt them and kill them at a higher rate, but since they saw collectivization as something that the Russians were imposing on them, they were more likely to rebel against the collectivization. And also many indigenous cultures were against this new form of Soviet collectivization, which is kind of absurd given the fact that they were more collectivist, these indigenous people, like the Bashkirs, Tatars, and for example, the people of Yakutsk. So, but on the other hand, what Soviets were doing was not equivalent to feudal collectivism. It was something completely new, this idea that tens of thousands of peasants should live essentially on the collective farm and share tools and land together. But okay, that's a topic for another video. But behind these protests, there is a complex history of systemic racism. That was my point in Russia. And what triggered this new way of protest in Bashkortostan is actually that one of their very popular indigenous rights activists got jailed. Why is he in jail? Because he opposed like evil Russian capitalist companies forming a new mine on a hill that was supposed to be secret for the people of Bashkortostan. And now he ended up going to jail. He was actually charged with hate speech, like a very questionable thing to accuse him of. And to the people of Bashkortostan, it is obvious that he actually went to jail because his opposition to the new mines being opened, and now his arrest triggered a wave of protest in Bashkortostan. And okay, I do not think that these protests in and of themselves are going to change anything, but if this same scenario happens in other far eastern regions and in other less developed regions that also have a complex history of being exploited in the Russian Empire and to an extent in the Soviet Union, that could destabilize the regime. For example, if people of those republics decide to escape from the military, that could be disastrous. Or just if they create enough chaos behind Russian lines, that could also potentially be a very big problem for Russia. And one thing that I would say history taught us is when the Russian people are fanatical about fighting the invader or the enemy that they truly see as the evil enemy that's coming to take their land or even annex their land as Hitler or Napoleon, then they're ready to fight to the last breath. And in that scenario, it is pretty much impossible to win against Russia. But if the Russian people began to see the war as something that is only in the interest of the corrupt elites in power, then I believe that the Ukrainians actually have a solid chance of reclaiming their lost territory. And for example, let's go with Americans in Vietnam. America definitely did have enough both manpower and money and just military might to continue the war. But what happened? The American people on a collective scale lost the will to fight. On the one hand, people were bitter because their brothers and fathers and friends were dying in a war that, as it appeared, had no clear end in sight, because the Viet Cong were fanatical about uniting their country and they were being helped by equally fanatical Soviets and Mao Zedong. So if we follow the example of Vietnam, it was crucial for the Vietnamese people that they were not abandoned by their allies, which I believe will also be crucial for the Ukrainians, that their allies do not stop helping them financially. And I mean, even if the United States stops helping them, well, that would be a huge problem. But South Korea recently decided to kind of heroically send them even more aid. But okay, let us return to the Vietnam example. On the other hand, stories of American war crimes also outraged many Americans and generally just people in the world. And the American people themselves began to protest against the war that they just saw as pointless, as imperialistic, as a war that has no clear end in sight. And here is that iconic image of a hippie girl protesting against the military. And what's kind of funny is that actually the hippies won in that conflict in the end, because even the establishment realized that there is no point in continuing this war. And of course there was also this racial dimension that I would argue exists in Russia today. The racial dimension was that black people were recruited at higher rates than white people and sent to die in Vietnam, which is why Martin Luther King also opposed the war. But there already was a war that's in literature called the Soviet Vietnam, and that was the war in Afghanistan, where the United States continued to fanatically support the Taliban, and the Taliban were also able to use their mountainous terrain against the Soviets, which, okay, the Ukrainians don't have a luxury of having mountainous terrain like the Taliban did, but my point is the Soviets could have continued the war in Afghanistan, but it simply seemed pointless to Gorbachev and to the military establishment to continue this war that had no clear end in sight. And big economic problems that began to occur in the Soviet Union actually also led Gorbachev to realize that it is time to end the war in Afghanistan, because it was very expensive and the Soviet economy began to kind of crumble because of internal problems. And what's also interesting is that at the time Soviets saw 20,000 of their own men dying in Afghanistan as too much, and today we are talking about 300,000 Russians that died in Ukraine. But okay, as I already said, the real reason why Gorbachev had to stop the war was because Soviet economy was suffering from many internal problems. Their agriculture was simply very bad and inefficient because the general secretaries continued to make their collective farms bigger because they naively believed that bigger farms are better, but it turns out they are not. Then there was the oil crisis, with the oil prices going down, and in the end Gorbachev was just a very good leader that actually realized that there are some more important things than simply controlling territory and always winning in a war. He did want to make the world a more peaceful place, actually. On the one hand, we actually can observe the fact that the Putin regime turned out to be more stable than it was originally believed. Putin did manage to simply shift his oil trade to the east, to China, India, and other countries, which is why the Russian economy has not collapsed. But on the other hand, I did read some analysts that say that in the long run, in 5 to 10 years, the Russian economy will be severely damaged by a few other factors that are not often discussed. The second most profitable branch of the Russian economy after oil is export of weapons. And India, one of the largest buyers of Russian tanks and planes and just other military equipment, is currently starting to buy more from other countries like the United States, perhaps Turkey, because Russia simply cannot afford to sell their tanks and other equipment to other countries right now because they are busy using their tanks in Ukraine. And also, let me just point the obvious, but investing millions into tanks that just get destroyed on the battlefield is definitely not profitable. And in the long run, it will create problems for the Russian economy. In the short run, wars can even be used to escape from economic crisis, which is what happened with World War II, for example, in America. And to an extent is happening right now, both in the United States and Russia, with a new spike in employment occurring in both countries due to this new war. But in the long run, if you experience a spike in employment because you are producing weapons that then just get destroyed, in the long run that's not profitable, and that will lead to a crisis probably, especially if you don't get anything valuable from that war, like if you are not able to use the resources you gained from that war. And also one other thing is beginning to show weakness of the Russian system, and that is their their heating systems are beginning to break all across the country, and for republics and for regions such as Yakutsk, the coldest city on earth, that is a problem. When you're experiencing minus 50 Celsius during the day, then bad heating systems that are beginning to crack due to a lack of investment, well, that could also potentially lead to protests. And in some parts of Russia, the people already are protesting, because when you invest so much in your military, then of course that your civilian infrastructure is going to be hurt by your investment. And my main point is, yes, that in wars like the Second World War, where Russians were truly fighting against an imperialist enemy that was genocidal, that wanted to kill them, in such wars it is almost impossible to win against Russia due to their great numbers and vastness of their country, their resources. But in wars like World War I, where Russian people actually realized they're being exploited by the corrupt elites, as Lenin used to say, as the corrupt elites that just want to enrich themselves and make everybody else in Russia poorer. If the people began to believe in what Lenin used to say in World War I, then the Russians and Russia as a country definitely is likely to lose, because that is exactly what happened in the First World War. A wave of mass desertations and low morale basically led to Russia losing the war. And then Germany, fortunately for Lenin and fortunately for Russia, actually ended up losing the war anyway, so they got their territory back. But the First World War was actually lost by Russia, precisely because the Russian people lacked motivation to continue to fight for the corrupt elites that simply use them as cannon meat. And I'm not saying that I know what will happen. I really actually have no idea what will happen with this war in Ukraine, but I just wanted to present a realistic scenario in which Russia loses the war, because I still do think there exists a realistic scenario in which Russia loses the war, although I'm not saying it will happen. But my point is just that it is still not impossible. Okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more videos like this.